Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a moment to understand something that is often misunderstood, not just in relationships, but in human biology. Avoidant behavior is not a character flaw. It's a survival response. When a partner pulls away emotionally, what you're often seeing is a nervous system that was trained by past environments to equate closeness with danger. Somewhere in their history, connection may have meant judgment, pressure, chaos, or disappointment. So their brain adapted. It learned distance is safety. But here's the truth. That same brain is still wired for connection. It just learned to fear the very thing it longs for. So what melts that avoidance? When we think about love and connection, we often assume that closeness is the ultimate goal. We associate emotional intimacy with words like vulnerability, openness, and transparency. But for someone with an avoidant attachment style, closeness is not inherently comforting. It can be experienced as threatening. To understand this dynamic, we must shift the way we view emotional connection. For the avoidant partner, closeness often triggers a deep and unconscious association with emotional enmeshment, loss of control, or potential rejection. The root of their avoidant pattern is not a lack of desire for connection. It's the absence of felt safety in emotionally intimate environments. Avoidant partners typically learned through early relational experiences that their needs were either overwhelming to others or consistently unmet. Perhaps caregivers were dismissive, emotionally distant, or critical. In such environments, closeness was not a sanctuary, it was a place of pain or confusion. As a result, the avoidant nervous system adapted. It learned to self-soothe through distance, control, and independence. It learned to value autonomy, not just as a preference, but as a requirement for emotional survival. This is where many partners get it wrong. They try to offer closeness as a form of love without realizing that for the avoidant partner, closeness feels like pressure. Even well-intentioned gestures, frequent texts, surprise visits, or intense emotional conversations can trigger the avoidant person's fight or flight response. The avoidant brain begins interpreting those acts as intrusions, as attempts to consume their autonomy, not because they don't care, but because their nervous system has been shaped by an equation: closeness, potential pain. So what's the solution? You don't begin with closeness. You begin with safety. Safety is the biological foundation for all secure attachment, and it's not built through emotional intensity. It's built through emotional reliability, a calm voice, a regulated tone, predictable behavior, an absence of control or criticism. These are the cues that the avoidant nervous system registers as safe. When they experience you as non-threatening, not just intellectually, but physiologically, they begin to loosen their grip on emotional distance. They don't rush in, they don't open up overnight, but their defenses begin to soften. This shift isn't conscious at first. It's neurobiological. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, starts to calm down. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional reasoning, begins to re-engage. The body starts to recognize that presence doesn't always mean pressure, and connection doesn't always equal cost. The emotional safety you provide becomes the new data that updates their internal model of relationships. It's essential to note that emotional safety is not about coddling or self-sacrifice. It's about grounded presence. It's about expressing yourself clearly, calmly, and without emotional volatility. When you can share your truth without blame and respect their need for time or space without resentment, you offer a kind of secure energy that is deeply disarming to avoidant defenses. In this kind of environment, the avoidant partner is more likely to test the waters of vulnerability. They may not say, "I need you," but they'll start to make small bids for connection. They may ask a casual question about your day. They may initiate small acts of care. These gestures are not trivial. They're nervous system experiments. They're testing whether their authentic self will be met with safety or judgment. Your consistent, non-reactive presence becomes the answer to that question. Over time, as trust compounds, their avoidance gives way to cautious openness. They begin to feel that it's safe to stay, not because you forced closeness on them, but because you built a foundation of safety strong enough to support it. So remember, if you're trying to connect with someone who leans avoidant, don't chase closeness. Create safety. The closeness will come, but it will come at the pace of trust, not urgency. You're not bypassing their defenses. You're making them obsolete. You're not trying to change them. You're showing them they no longer have to protect themselves from love. In relationships, it's easy to want the end result before the process, but the avoidant partner needs something more powerful than persuasion. They need nervous system safety. They need to feel, without a word, that your presence is not a threat, but a refuge. And that starts with how you show up calm, clear, grounded. That's how closeness becomes not just possible, but sustainable. In any relationship, one of the most stabilizing forces is consistency, not just in words, but in tone, timing, behavior, and energy. For an avoidant partner, consistency is not merely comforting, it's foundational. This is because avoidantly attached individuals tend to have grown up in unpredictable emotional environments where warmth might have been followed by criticism or where love was conditional upon performance or behavior. The nervous system, particularly during early developmental stages, internalizes this inconsistency and builds protective mechanisms around it. This is why avoidant individuals often come to rely heavily on themselves. They've learned that others cannot be consistently counted on. So, when someone begins to offer emotional consistency, it's not instantly soothing. At first, it's suspicious. It may even trigger resistance. Why? Because the avoidant brain is always scanning for patterns of instability. When someone shows affection today, the avoidant partner unconsciously wonders if it will be withdrawn tomorrow. Their nervous system is wired to detect inconsistency because to them, inconsistency equals danger. However, when they are met with consistent emotional signals, predictable behavior, reliable responses, calm communication, the nervous system begins to recalibrate. It stops anticipating harm. Over time, the brain starts to associate presence with peace rather than pressure. What consistency does is create a controlled environment where the avoidant partner doesn't have to be on high alert. They're no longer bracing for the emotional roller coaster that often define their formative experiences. And here's the science: consistent relational experiences allow the amygdala to down-regulate its fear response. The prefrontal cortex begins to reassert control, allowing for more nuanced emotional processing. This is when genuine connection becomes possible, not because the avoidant partner suddenly becomes secure, but because their brain begins to learn a new pattern. People can be trusted if they are emotionally consistent. But consistency must come without control. It's not about showing up the same way so the other person changes. It's about showing up the same way because you are grounded, stable, and authentic. When your emotional tone doesn't shift based on their reactions, you create safety. When you say what you mean and follow through, you begin to dismantle the avoidance core fear that people are unreliable and unsafe. Now, connected to this is one of the most misunderstood aspects of relating to an avoidant partner: their need for space. Many people interpret an avoidant partner's withdrawal as rejection. It feels personal, painful, like their distance must be a reflection of your unworthiness. But in most cases, it's not. Space to the avoidant individual is regulation. It's how they reset their internal world when the emotional environment becomes overstimulating. In relationships, especially with securely or anxiously attached partners, emotions can become fast, intense, and layered. The avoidant brain, which already associates intimacy with the risk of loss of control, becomes overwhelmed. Space is their way of calming the storm, not pushing love away, but preventing emotional collapse. It's crucial to understand this without romanticizing it. Avoidant patterns are not an excuse to dismiss a partner's emotional needs. But when we reframe space as a self-regulating strategy rather than a rejection, we no longer respond with panic. We respond with presence. We say, take what you need. I'm here when you're ready, rather than, why are you pulling away? This one shift can completely transform relational dynamics. By not personalizing their need for space, you do something powerful. You allow their autonomy to coexist with connection. This is what the avoidant partner needs most: to be in relationship without feeling engulfed. If they feel that love always demands closeness and explanation, they will retreat. But if they are allowed to regulate on their terms without being punished for it, they begin to rewire the association between closeness and control. In time, they will need less space, not because they've been pressured to change, but because the nervous system no longer equates closeness with danger. They will come closer naturally because they've learned that connection with you does not cost them their independence. It supports it. Consistency and space, when properly understood and practiced, are not opposing forces. They are complementary. Consistency is what stabilizes the nervous system. Space is what gives it room to breathe, Together, they create the conditions for trust to grow, not because either partner forces change, but because they allow each other to exist fully and safely within the relationship. That is where transformation begins, not in pressure, not in performance, but in presence and patience. In relationships with an avoidant partner, the way emotions are expressed can either invite connection or trigger retreat. It's a misconception to think avoidant individuals don't feel deeply. They do. What they struggle with is emotional expression in environments that feel unpredictable, intense, or emotionally charged. When confronted with overt emotional demands, especially those that come across as urgent, blaming, or overwhelming, their nervous system goes into self-protection. This isn't always visible. They may become quiet, shut down, change the subject, or minimize what's being shared. But what's happening inside is a wave of internal dysregulation. Their brain, primed to perceive emotional vulnerability as dangerous or invasive, pulls the emergency brake. This is why emotions must be shared with clarity and composure, not to hide their intensity, but to prevent their delivery from becoming a threat. When you say, "You make me feel abandoned," it creates defensiveness, even if unintentionally. The avoidant partner hears blame and reacts by closing off. But when you shift the language to, "When I don't hear from you, I notice I start to feel anxious," you create space for connection without pressure. You shift the emotional frame from accusation to self-awareness. This distinction is not minor, it's neurobiological. The prefrontal cortex responds to calm, grounded language. The amygdala responds to perceived attack. In an avoidant partner, that distinction determines whether they lean in or check out. Pressure, even when disguised as vulnerability, tells the avoidant nervous system, "You are responsible for my emotional regulation." That burden feels overwhelming, especially for someone whose default coping strategy is emotional distancing. But when emotion is offered without pressure, without an agenda, and without urgency, the avoidant partner begins to learn, "I can be near emotion and not lose myself in it." This is the beginning of a new internal model, a blueprint of intimacy that includes space for self and other without collapse. Linked to this is the way trust must be approached. Many people demand trust early in a relationship, confusing closeness with entitlement to another's inner world. But trust, especially for the avoidant partner, is not something that can be fast-tracked. It's not a choice, it's a response. And it's not built in grand gestures. It's built in the micro moments. When you do what you say, when you react calmly to discomfort, when you hold your own emotional weight with maturity, the avoidant partner watches these things. Not always consciously, but their nervous system does. It tracks patterns. It notices, are you safe when you're angry? Are you still kind when you're hurt? Can you handle your own distress without using me as a regulator? Every time you show that you can be steady without demanding emotional performance from them, you build trust. It's a quiet process, often invisible. But eventually, their nervous system begins to associate you with predictability, with calm, with emotional containment rather than emotional chaos. That's when their walls start to soften. Not because you forced them to open up, but because you gave them a reason to. Avoidant attachment is not a fixed identity. It's a stress-based response. And what so often changes, it is not a breakthrough conversation or a moment of deep revelation, but consistent exposure to secure energy. This is the final and often most overlooked element. Nervous systems co-regulate. Humans mirror each other's internal states, often below the level of conscious awareness. If you bring anxiety, urgency, or fear into the relational space, it activates those same states in the avoidant partner, even if you're saying all the right things. But if you bring roundedness, emotional self, responsibility, and patience, their system starts to align with yours. Secure energy is not passive. It's active stability. It's showing that you know who you are, that you can feel big things without collapsing under them, and that you're not trying to change someone in order to feel okay yourself. This kind of presence is powerful. It communicates without words. You don't need to protect yourself from me. I'm not going to chase you, fix you, or pressure you, but I'm not going to disappear either. That energy creates a paradox for the avoidant partner. They begin to feel safe while staying connected. And that's what shifts the pattern. That's what teaches their nervous system that love doesn't have to cost freedom. When you express emotion without pressure, allow trust to unfold organically, and bring secure energy into the relationship, you're not trying to melt the avoidant partner through force or intensity. You're melting them through safety, through repetition, through the quiet power of showing up in a way their nervous system has never experienced before. That's not just love, that's healing. When engaging in a relationship with an avoidant partner, the very fabric of connection must be built differently. What creates bonding for one person can trigger distancing in another. For the avoidantly attached, closeness does not automatically signal warmth or intimacy. In fact, it can evoke the exact opposite: anxiety, overwhelm, and fear of engulfment. To foster connection in this dynamic, the foundational element must be safety, not the illusion of safety through closeness, but a deep, embodied sense of emotional and psychological security that comes from how you show up over time. For the avoidant individual, closeness without safety feels like pressure, and pressure activates protective withdrawal. The avoidant pattern is not a lack of interest or care. It is an adaptive survival mechanism, often rooted in early experiences where emotional needs were ignored, minimized, or punished. In those early relational environments, the nervous system learned that being too close often led to disappointment or intrusion. As a result, distance became their form of regulation. This means that even when they deeply desire intimacy, their nervous system associates connection with risk. Therefore, the first and most essential step is not emotional intensity, it is safety. Safety looks like calm tone, reliability, non-reactivity, and clear, grounded communication. When you can provide that consistently, you begin to gently teach their nervous system you are not a threat. This brings us to the second key layer: consistency. Consistency is not about being perfect, it's about being predictable. For someone who expects relationships to swing between affection and abandonment, your steadiness becomes a new kind of medicine. The avoidant partner is unconsciously scanning for inconsistency because that's what they were trained to detect in their earliest connections. When your behavior is emotionally erratic, warm one moment and demanding the next, it confirms their internal belief that closeness leads to instability. But when you show up consistently, responding with grounded presence, even in difficult moments, you begin to regulate their internal chaos. Their nervous system, wired for defense, starts to recalibrate. The hypervigilance softens. And without even saying a word, you begin to become a safe emotional home. But safety also means honoring their coping strategies, especially their need for space. This is a point of misunderstanding for many. When an avoidant partner asks for space, it's often interpreted as disinterest or rejection. But in reality, it's often a vital form of regulation. Their threshold for emotional intensity is lower than average, not because they feel less, but because they process slowly, internally, and often with a deep fear of being overwhelmed. Giving them space isn't about giving up, it's about respecting the pace at which they feel safe re-engaging. When you honor that without resentment or protest, you affirm something essential: their autonomy matters. And when autonomy is respected, connection becomes less threatening. The challenge for many partners is that when emotions run high, there's a natural tendency to push for resolution or closeness. You want to talk, clarify, get back harmony. But for an avoidant partner, this can feel like emotional demand, which reactivates their need to distance. This is where emotional expression must be handled with care. Sharing your feelings is necessary, but how you do it makes all the difference. If your tone is urgent, blaming, or emotionally charged, their brain hears danger, not vulnerability. But if you can own your feelings without assigning responsibility, using statements instead of accusations, you offer emotion without pressure. Saying, "I feel anxious when we go silent" is radically different from saying, "You always shut down on me." The first invites connection. The second threatens it. When your emotions are expressed calmly, without urgency or the expectation that the other person must immediately fix or resolve them, you help deactivate the avoidance defensive wiring. You allow them to stay present rather than retreat. And in that presence, something new is possible. They can hear you. They can consider you. They can trust that your emotional world is not a threat to their independence, but a bridge to deeper understanding. In truth, all these elements, safety, consistency, space, and low pressure emotion, are interconnected. They form the relational atmosphere in which an avoidant partner can begin to soften. Not because they've been persuaded or pressured to change, but because their body no longer feels the need to protect itself so aggressively. This is not about strategy or manipulation. It's about becoming the kind of presence that disarms fear through steady, honest, emotionally mature connection. When you embody this, you don't chase closeness. You create the conditions where it naturally arises. That is how you melt the avoidant partner. That is how love becomes safe again. In relationships where one partner has an avoidant attachment style, the rules of emotional engagement are different, not because they care less, but because their nervous system interprets closeness in a fundamentally different way. Many people assume that getting closer, opening up more, or showing increased affection will pull the avoidant person in. But that approach often backfires. What truly allows the avoidant partner to soften and come forward is safety, not just emotional safety, but physiological safety. Their body must stop scanning for threat before their heart can start opening. This doesn't happen through intensity, it happens through presence. The avoidant nervous system has been conditioned, usually early in life, to perceive intimacy as a potential danger. Maybe they had caregivers who were emotionally inconsistent, intrusive, or unresponsive. Maybe expressing vulnerability once resulted in criticism or rejection. As a result, the body learned a lesson: stay in control, stay distant, stay safe. This means that emotional closeness, which might feel comforting to some, can feel invasive to the avoidant. So when their partner leans in too fast, too hard, or with too much urgency, their system retreats, not from love, but from perceived threat. That's why consistency becomes so powerful. Avoidant individuals are constantly on alert for shifts in emotional tone. They are watching to see if affection turns into neediness, if vulnerability turns into volatility, or if warmth is used as leverage. They've learned that people's emotions are unpredictable, and unpredictability is threatening. Consistency slowly undoes that narrative. When you speak the same way today as you did yesterday, when your presence is steady even in conflict, when your tone doesn't escalate with disappointment, the avoidant partner's nervous system starts to relax. They begin to trust, not because you ask them to, but because your behavior tells their body, I'm safe here. There's no hidden trap. There's no emotional bait and switch. This regulation takes time. And during that time, space is often part of the avoidant partner's rhythm. When things become emotionally intense or fast-paced, they may instinctively pull away. This is not always about disinterest. It's about overload. Their system gets flooded, and space becomes their coping strategy. In those moments, if you react with panic, protest, or pressure, it confirms their fear closeness equals chaos. But if you allow space with grace, without making it personal, you create a paradoxical effect. You demonstrate that your connection doesn't require their constant proximity to be valid. You allow autonomy without withdrawing love. And that's what keeps the door open for return. Space, when respected, becomes less necessary because as their nervous system begins to trust that emotional connection does not demand their disappearance, they stop needing to run so often. This is where emotional expression plays a key role. If your emotional needs are shared with urgency or blame, the avoidant partner feels cornered. But if you can speak from ownership, saying, I feel, rather than you avoid activating their defenses. Calm, clear emotional communication shows them that feelings can be expressed without conflict, guilt, or punishment. It proves that emotions don't have to be messy or manipulative. And all of this gradually leads to the rebuilding of trust. But trust for an avoidant partner doesn't grow from declarations. It grows from repetition, from tiny moments where you stay calm when they expect you to erupt, from showing them that they can say, I need some time, and you'll respond with respect, not pressure. Every one of those moments tells their nervous system something it never got to believe before. Connection doesn't always come at the cost of freedom. Trust, in this context, is not a leap. It's a slow exposure to safety. It's an ongoing test, subtle, unspoken, and deeply biological. That's why you cannot demand it. You must live it. You must become the person whose presence teaches them that connection can coexist with peace, that they can come forward without losing themselves, that you will not require emotional performance, nor will you collapse if they struggle to express themselves. In time, when the avoidant partner begins to feel that your love is not a trap, but a choice, a safe, stable space they can re-enter at their own pace, they will start to risk showing more of themselves. Not out of obligation, but because their body tells them it's finally okay to stay. That's not the result of pressure. It's the result of being trustworthy, repeatedly, gently, and without demand. In relationships involving an avoidant partner, transformation doesn't begin with emotional intensity. It begins with emotional safety. The avoidant individual is not emotionally numb. Rather, their nervous system has been shaped to equate closeness with risk. This wiring is often the result of early experiences where love was unpredictable, conditional, or overwhelming. For them, intimacy was not synonymous with safety. It often came with the burden of performance, the fear of engulfment, or the pain of disappointment. Their brain adapted accordingly, creating a self-protective pattern that avoids vulnerability, not because they don't care, but because their body learned to associate it with threat. That's why, if you want to truly reach an avoidant partner, the first requirement isn't more connection, it's safety. And safety is not built through dramatic conversations or emotional persuasion. It is built through calm, regulated presence over time. Your tone, timing, facial expressions, and emotional reactions are all data points that their nervous system is interpreting moment by moment. If your presence feels reactive or chaotic, even unconsciously, their protective instincts will activate. But when you show up consistently with roundedness, stability, and emotional containment, you offer their nervous system something it rarely had: predictability. And predictability calms the avoidant mind in a way words cannot. This leads directly into the role of consistency. Avoidant partners are not looking for perfection, but they are incredibly sensitive to emotional inconsistency. They may not always articulate it, but their body is scanning for signs of volatility or instability. If you are loving one moment and withdrawn the next, if your words don't match your energy, or if your affection shifts when you don't get what you want, it confirms their deep fear relationships are unsafe and people are unreliable. But when your presence is emotionally consistent, when your warmth remains even in moments of disappointment, when your communication stays respectful even during conflict, you regulate their internal alarm system. Slowly, their nervous system begins to trust that your closeness doesn't come with hidden expectations or emotional volatility. Alongside consistency comes another crucial element: the honoring of space. Avoidant partners often need more emotional breathing room than others. When overwhelmed, they tend to withdraw, not to punish, but to self-regulate. The mistake many make is interpreting this need as rejection. But for the avoidant person, space is not about pushing you away. It's about regaining internal stability. If you rush in with protest or anxiety, it often reinforces their need for more space. But if you can allow that space without resentment, if you can say, in your energy as much as your words, take what you need, I'm here when you're ready, you offer them something few ever have: autonomy without emotional consequence. Ironically, this often shortens the time they need away because space granted freely is less likely to be clung to. Yet space alone is not enough. What you bring into the connection matters deeply, and that includes how you express emotion. Avoidant partners are often sensitive to emotional expression that feels pressuring, chaotic, or demanding. When you communicate your feelings in ways that are grounded, self-owned, and without blame, their system stays more open. Instead of, "You never listen to me," you might say, "I notice I feel unheard when we don't talk about things." That subtle difference reduces pressure while increasing emotional clarity. It says, "I have needs, but I don't need to control you to meet them." That balance disarms defenses and allows space for actual connection. As these elements build safety, consistency, respect for space, and non-pressuring emotion, something profound begins to happen: trust. But trust with an avoidant partner does not grow from declarations or expectations. It grows from experience, from small moments that accumulate into a nervous system recognition: this person is safe. This relationship does not require me to abandon myself. Trust for them is not a leap. It is a long exposure to someone who doesn't weaponize closeness, doesn't collapse under emotion, and doesn't chase or punish when distance is needed. And this brings us to perhaps the most underestimated factor: your internal state. Nervous systems co-regulate. The energy you bring into a relationship is contagious. If you are anxious, reactive, or emotionally inconsistent, it subtly destabilizes the avoidant partner, even if your words sound secure. But when you are grounded, calm, emotionally responsible, and self-aware, you begin to shift the dynamic from the inside out. You model a secure attachment pattern, not by forcing them to match it, but by embodying it. Your regulation teaches their body what safety feels like. And as their body starts to trust your nervous system, their defenses begin to soften. This is not about fixing or saving them. It's about being someone who doesn't require them to live in survival mode anymore. You become the one experience their nervous system never had: safety that stays. And in that experience, avoidance slowly gives way to connection, not forced, not fast, but real. Built one calm breath, one stable response, one trustworthy moment at a time.